Hello, History of Medicine students. This is Professor Bowen here. Just wanted to give some comments on our quiz 4 of the semester, which we had last week. If you'll remember, this is the quiz that dealt with social constructionism and the history of the French disease. In this video, I want to focus my comments on the first question from the quiz. If you remember, this is the one that dealt with social constructionism particularly, and I asked you to pick a specific medical condition, a disease of your choosing, and examine the extent to which the way it's defined, people's experiences of it, or social or medical responses to it are influenced by non-biological forces and factors. So I wanted to share some of the results of your responses. Among those diseases we tended to agree as being socially constructed were infertility, COVID-19, cancer, especially breast cancer, depression, HIV/AIDS, leprosy, deafness, bubonic plague, and homosexuality. Some of you in your responses talked about diseases that you didn't feel met the criteria for social construction. Among those were cancer and blindness, and I'm going to talk about both of those in just a moment. But before getting to that, I wanted to clear up some general things regarding social constructionism as it pertains to medicine, health, and illness. One of the things that we have to take into account here is that when we talk about the social construction of disease, we're talking about the social construction of disease. In other words, in order for something to be socially constructed as a disease, it needs to be already identified in the society we're talking about as an illness, as a medical condition of some kind. As the sociologists Conrad and Barker put it, social constructionism is a framework that emphasizes the cultural and historical aspects of phenomena widely thought to be exclusively natural. And that last word, natural, is really key. Some of you in your responses talked about how in the past things like infertility or insanity or depression were understood to be not medical conditions, but more spiritual conditions that resulted from things like divine anger, disfavor from the gods, and whatnot. Those are all examples of how social factors impact the way that people think about different kinds of conditions, but the fact that those conditions weren't believed to be diseases in the past means that the whole concept of social constructionism of disease doesn't really apply, right? It has to be something that we already think of as naturally occurring, not supernatural. Another thing that I want to clarify here, some of us perhaps have the idea that socially constructed illnesses are ones that don't have a firm biological basis. Like some people might say, oh, socially constructed diseases are diseases that aren't really real. We might say that socially constructed diseases are just things that are in our head. They don't have any kind of material or biological foundation to them. But that is not what social constructionism is all about. It's not like we draw a line between diseases that are socially constructed and those that aren't. In fact, we say that even diseases that do have a clear physiological, biological mechanism behind them and that do manifest themselves in the body with certain kinds of symptoms, even those can be socially constructed. There is a social component to all of these diseases, whether we see them as physical diseases or mental diseases or whatever the case may be. So as Andrews puts it quite nicely in 2012, quote, "One can believe that concepts are constructed rather than discovered, yet maintain that they correspond to something real in the world, right? So socially constructed diseases are real diseases. One of the particular examples that came up in the quiz was cancer. Is cancer a socially constructed illness? And on what grounds might we say that it is socially constructed? In fact, there have been a lot of historians and social scientists who have made the case that cancer is a socially constructed disease. And there are good grounds for thinking that, right? So we know that, of course, cancer has a biological component to it. Depending on the kinds of cancer we're talking about, there are consistent symptoms that are universal in the sense that people who have breast cancer tend to have the same things happening to their bodies all around the world, regardless of where they come from, right? We see the same of lung cancer and liver cancer and prostate cancer, right, etc. There is a kind of common biological foundation to these diseases. And yet, we also know that there is a huge social dimension to cancers as well, because the way that we think about them is not just defined by what happens to our bodies, not defined by the symptoms or the cause. There are all these additional layers packed on top of that biological foundation, and these are the things that actually have a pretty strong impact on what we think about cancer, what we think about the kinds of people that get cancer, the kinds of things that people do if they have cancer, their understanding of it, their experience of it, their responses to it. All this is really highly influenced by social and cultural variables. One of the first people to really make this clear was Susan Sontag, who in a 1978 book called Illness as Metaphor talked about all of the different ways that we have particular beliefs around cancer. For example, she said, looking at media coverage of cancer, that we tend to think of it as a disease that happens to people who have lost the creative spark in life, who have resigned themselves to a life of sadness or a life of inactivity. And we have this idea that kind of cancer is like failure. Cancer is what happens to people who are inactive, who have not met with much success in their personal or professional lives. And that is a really negative, shameful idea about cancer that actually impacts the way that people experience the disease. Among other things, Sontag argued that that makes people less likely to seek out treatment because they internalize this sense of having done something wrong, and that's why they have cancer. That has nothing to do with the biology of the disease. That's not a physical symptom of cancer, but it is one of the things that people with cancer often feel, this sense that they have failed in a really powerful way to accomplish their goals. And so that gives us some pretty strong evidence that cancer has a social component, that it is a socially constructed disease. Another example that was brought up in the quiz as something that is not socially constructed is blindness. At first glance, it might seem obvious that blindness is a relatively straightforward physical condition. There are obviously lots of ways that people can become blind, but again, it does have a common set of underlying physical symptoms, specifically reduced, limited, or non-existent vision. But again, that's not the totality of blindness. That's not the sum total of all the meanings that we attribute to blindness. And that's not the only thing that people who are blind experience. So one of the first people to recognize this was the sociologist Robert Scott, who in a 1968 book called The Making of Blind Men pointed out that blindness as an idea really stems from our understanding of kind of like what blind people should and should not be able to do. And that understanding has nothing to do with what blind people actually can and cannot do, right? So we tend to think, for example, that blind people can't ride bicycles, or we might say that blind people can't climb trees, or that blind people can't work in factories. We have this kind of really strong stigma against blindness that goes back to religious texts. Like, for example, the Bible says, the blind can't lead the blind. And those ideas aren't biological. They're not a product of the physical set of symptoms that we equate with blindness. Those are just social assumptions that we have made about blind people that have been passed down over the generations. For evidence of this, one thing I would really encourage you to check out is this guy, Daniel Kish, who is sometimes known as Batman. He is a blind American man who created this technique of echolocation through clicking, kind of like sonar, that allows him basically to see around the world in a way that is very similar to the way that sighted people go about their everyday environments. So Daniel Kish, a blind person, can do things like ride bikes and climb trees and have jobs and walk down the street without incident by using this technique of clicking. And this is something that he actually trains other blind people to do. So it might seem at first glance, again, that like blindness is a relatively straightforward physical impairment, but it's not, because blindness, as we understand it, is a product of our social expectations, our expectations of what blind people should and shouldn't be able to do. And those, again, really have little to do with what blind people can actually do in their day-to-day lives. So again, blindness is a good candidate for a socially constructed disease. To sum things up, so one of the big points that I want to make here is that all diseases are socially constructed. All diseases have a social component because it's not clear, ever really, where to draw the line between health and illness. This is not something that we can easily determine on the basis of biology. And when we try to draw those lines, it's often culture that drives our decision. The boundary line between the normal and the pathological isn't obvious. It's not natural. It's something that societies decide on the basis of expectations, ideologies, attitudes, and values that have little to do really with biology. So this means that social constructionism is something that can be applied to any disease. We can take a constructionist approach to any illness, any disability, any impairment, and really learn something powerful about the way that culture shapes illness. So that's all I wanted to say for this short little video. If you have questions about any of this, please feel free to get in touch with me, however works for you. I'd be happy to continue this conversation in whatever forums you're comfortable with, and I'm curious to know your thoughts about this. So hopefully that all helped clarify some things, and looking forward to this week's discussion. So see you later. Thanks for watching and listening. Bye-bye.